Too many CEOs think finance's sole job is to control spending. Well, yes, it's to control spending, but not necessarily to minimize spending. A good company has an impactful finance function, a function that truly influences and plays in the business. If your company thinks of finance as a back office function, sort of a la Dilbert, and full of accounting trolls who linger in the basement and who live to create bureaucracy in the business, you've really got an imperception or a misperception of finance, and you're missing an opportunity to have a function that can have a tremendous positive impact on your performance. Finance is effectively the rhythm section of a company. It creates the company cadence that every company needs. So when you think about things like the monthly financial close and maybe the weekly sales report and the annual budgeting process and possibly the annual strategic planning process, they're a frame within which the company has a conversation and makes decisions and choices. And that conversation is worth thinking about. What do I mean when I say the company conversation? If you think about it, most companies now, most of the people in finance, we don't put bolts in sheet metal and we don't work on an assembly line. Most companies, it's about using information to make better decisions and moving that information around in increasingly creative ways. The key to that is to have a high quality conversation. The companies that have high quality conversations, almost by definition, are going to perform better. So what you need to know that when you have a discussion about your choices, that someone is taking those strategic choices and incorporating dollars and cents implications. And that's finance. And that's both short-term and long-term. It's not that finance should be, too many CEOs think finance's sole job is to control spending. Well, yes, it's to control spending, but not necessarily to minimize spending. It's meant to spend each dollar wisely and help a company think about how to spend each dollar wisely. Let me kind of give you an example of how finance impacts the entire conversation of a company. And consider an NBA game. I'm an NBA fan, so I'll use that. You get to a point in the game where there's a critical play, and what you always notice first is they call timeout, and 3 or 4 of the coaches, the head coach and his assistants, they all walk out on the floor with a clipboard and they all discuss what they're going to do before they tell the players what play they're going to run. They discuss what's the right strategy. So they're trying to make a choice, and you could say, well, what's involved in that decision? What's going on there? Well, you see the coaches and they're looking at a clipboard, but what you're not necessarily noticing, but which is absolutely a key part of that discussion, is the entire analytical framework that supports it. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's a scoreboard. So obviously these coaches are not having that discussion in a vacuum. They know what the current score is. They know how many timeouts they have left. They know all those different situations. They know how much time is left. They also have a very clear understanding of the metrics that are up on that scoreboard. They understand if a player has 4 fouls, that he has 6 allowed for the whole game, or they understand the different things that those scores are telling them. Those metrics are very clear to them. They also have a huge amount of information about the other team that's already part of their decision process. For example, they know that the team tends to run this type of defense in a certain situation, and they tend to they know their tendencies. All these things are a part of this conversation, but they're behind the scenes. And finally, there's the whole structure of the game, the rules of the game. Well, if I shoot behind this line, it's 3 points. If I shoot in front of this line, it's 2 points. If I get fouled, I'll go to the foul line, or I won't go to the foul line. These rules of the game are part of, if you can make an analogy to accounting. If finance creates the rules, they provide this whole sense of background and metrics and trends. They've defined the metrics and the score. And because all these things are there, it looks like those 4 coaches are just going out and having a quick conversation. But in fact, it's embedded with tons of background information. And that's the way finance operates in a company. When your management team gets together to have a discussion, they're not just having a discussion at that point in time. They're having a discussion that's layered on top of this entire framework that's created by the finance department. So finance is really responsible for providing that framework in a company. As a CEO or a CFO or a management team, 90% of the value you're getting is from the FP&A function. But I say this with a really important caveat. FP&A is more value added as long as the accounting works. If electricity is flowing through your house, I don't even notice it. But the minute electricity goes off, it's all I notice. What I notice are the things I can plug in. And if the electricity is not flowing through the walls, then it doesn't matter what I plug in, I'm not getting that value. So accounting is absolutely critical to run that for that process of getting you to point zero. If it doesn't work, you won't get beyond point zero. But that's how the two function together. Well, we just talked about the fact that you know that's where you're getting all your management value, your information value. You're getting it from the FP&A function, from the reporting and the forward-looking analysis. I think I read in a recent survey from Deloitte that 63% of CFOs said FP&A is the core finance function they would like to improve the most. And I totally get that. That is where you're getting the value. So you definitely want to improve that. And in that same survey, 46% said data analytics and forecasting was the one skill set they'd like to bolster on their finance team. And this goes hand in hand with the FP&A piece, right? Because FP&A is very different today than it was. It's no longer just a rudimentary variance analysis. This was the budget, this was the actual, and here was the difference, and what percentage difference was it? That's not very meaningful. The job of FP&A now is to provide real insight into the accounting information, to incorporate other information from other systems like CRM, HR, outside data, share data in some companies, churn data, all kinds of different information, and to incorporate that into a real analysis of the business. I think the other thing to think about with FP&A is you can kind of think of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. A very basic company has bookkeeping, and as a company grows even a little bit, they start to need more and more. They need more advanced bookkeeping. They need bookkeeping in accordance with GAAP. As they mature, they need a lot more information, specific reports for banks and things like that. And then they realize they need a whole dashboard of metrics for their business. So the more you have in information, the more you climb that need and need additional information to provide insight and drive things. If I had to kind of step back and say what the most important thing with FP&A is, they take all these analytics and information, they put it together for a sole purpose, to help a company make and frame choices. So, I'll use an example. When I say frame choices, my wife will always tell me, you can have that Oreo. It's a choice you're going to make, but you're making another choice at the same time. You've decided to at least temporarily abandon whatever diet you might be on at the current moment. You're making a choice. And that's what finance does with all these metrics. And that's what FP&A does. FP&A frames choices so that management knows that when they make this explicit choice, that there are a number of implicit choices that they are making at the same time. Making those implicit choices explicit is a key part of the FP&A mission. I have a couple of rules for metrics. First of all, metrics for a business need to be clearly defined. They need to be defined in a way that is absolutely without ambiguity. If they're not, I guarantee you, someone will, the minute the metric matters to somebody, they will figure out a way to rewrite it and redefine it. Another thing is metrics should be calculated regularly, and ideally they're generated automatically from source data. The reason I say that is because if it's an act of God every month to put together certain metrics, I guarantee you they'll eventually drift away and not be utilized in the business. Metrics should also be interpreted in context, not necessarily taken as absolutes. This is a key point, and it's part of what I always say: don't confuse accounting and analysis. Um, if for example, I have if I told you that my annualized employee attrition was 30%, you might think, wow, that seems really high, 30% attrition. But if I told you the business was the restaurant business, that's actually pretty good for a restaurant business. If I told you it was for a different kind of business, that would be really high. You have to look at metrics within a context and not think there's some magic to the number itself. Metrics are generally better interpreted in the context of trends, not for a single period. It's not really useful for me to know that the temperature is 99 today, as much as it's useful for me to know how does that compare to every other day in the month and every other day in the year. I can't really make an assessment of a metric just by looking at any one thing. Great example in a book I read called Factfulness, where they 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 compared the tons of carbon that were in the air in different countries, in India and China and the United States. And the Indian UN representative stood up and said, I never want to hear that number quoted without it being compared with the population of my country, because I have 1.4 billion people, and you're comparing an absolute number to a country that only has 330 million people. It doesn't make sense. And he was right. You shouldn't look at numbers without the context of other numbers. But I think that one key point I want to reiterate there is you need to start with a realization that there is no individual metric that tells the whole story. That's why we call it an analytical framework. It's a framework of metrics that together define your business.
To learn how FutureView software solutions can help your finance function, visit us at futureviewsystems.com.